I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And this is our podcast on Teenage Mutant Ninja / Hero Turtles. A cartoon series from the late 80s and early to mid 90s. When you look it up to see how long it actually ran for, you discover there are actually 10 seasons of it, airing between 1987 and 1996. And like Thundercats, the BBC bought it, or some of it, but in no way did they buy anything like all of it. They thought, well, we've got plenty to show and repeat well into the 90s, and that's what they did. I mentioned in our Saturday morning TV magazine shows podcast a couple of years ago that Going Live had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles instead of Thundercats latterly. They put it in that first cartoon slot. And I said in that podcast that it was at the height of the Turtles' popularity that Going Live did this. And I suspect that's a slight piece of misspeaking from me, and not the only one in any of these podcasts by any means. But if that was happening latterly in Going Live in the early 90s, that's probably out of the Turtles' main peak, and the BBC doubtless had shown all the Turtles that they were going to ever buy on CBBC by then, and stuck it on Going Live in a new time slot for perhaps a different non-after-school audience to enjoy, and it did cause quite a stir, at least when it first turned up on Going Live. A lot of anticipation for it, people writing in to say how excited they were, and someone wrote in to tell Philip Schofield to convince her brother that the lyric was turtle power and not to the park.
I do remember that.
Which he duly did. So yeah, Turtles was very much around and in the soup in the late 80s and early 90s. But yeah, probably past its peak of popularity when it came on Going Live, but certainly not at the end of its time of popularity. I want to talk first about memories of the time and of Teenage Mutant Ninja Hero Turtles being the fad that it was. I used to say that it was the one fad that people loved and talked about at school and tried to buy all the toys that I actually seriously bought into, and didn't particularly like it myself anyway, but rather liked it because it was the fad. And I think there is some truth in that. Things like Transformers and Pokemon and other fads I haven't got caught up in because other people were, and things I did like He-Man, I liked because I liked them, but I didn't really feel that way about Turtles. I got kind of caught up in a wave of, oh yes, everyone loves Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. So I do remember it quite uniquely in that way.
When I was in sort of reception year one, the boys in my class were obsessed with it. It was the boys who were obsessed with it, I remember. And I watched it too, and I think I liked it. I can't now tell you how much or why, I'm afraid, but I did used to watch it, and I knew all the characters, and I do remember being in the playground one day, goodness knows what I was doing, and these two boys coming up to me going, you don't know the name of this Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. So, of course, I said, yes, I do. And they went, what are they then? And I said, Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, and Michelangelo. And then they went, oh, no, that's the wrong order. And said them in a different order, I don't know what it was, and ran off. And that's my overriding memory to do with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from school.
And very indicative of its status as a big fad, and also very indicative of human nature and how it fits in with these fads.
Of course, it wasn't the wrong order, was it? They just wanted to not look stupid, having told me I didn't know their names when I did.
Let's get the title out of the way. Of course, I've been calling it Teenage Mutant Ninja / Hero Turtles, and it was an attempt by some international markets, including the UK, not to try and glorify the ninja aspect and make people want to fight each other with ninja ninja weapons and do ninja moves on each other.
Even though they do that in the show and don't mind admitting it, and a rose by any other name would smell as sweet.
And it was a pretty redundant attempt, really. Ninja was written on a lot of the merchandise. I had a turtle blimp at one point that had Ninja written on it. You could see it written in some comics and tie-in books and things. And the word ninja is sometimes used in the show. Boss, the turtles are trained ninjas. They'll make mush out of these guys. I think that's the Frog episode, Bebop says that, something like that. But still, the attempt was made, and I was reading quite recently that apparently the nunchucks, which is Michelangelo's weapon, as everybody knows, in particular, was something that the international market didn't like. And there's never a shot on the international broadcast version of Michelangelo actually using his nunchucks.
What?
Which I didn't notice at the time, but when we watched the episodes we have on video quite recently in preparation for this, he didn't use them, and I thought, well, how silly. Panthro uses nunchucks on the screen all the time. Why can't Michelangelo do it?
And they're worse than the sharp weapons, are they? The swords that Leonardo has and the little knives, I don't know their special ninja name, that Raphael has. I would think children would be more likely to hurt each other by accident with those.
So it's rather senseless, really, the ninja to hero stuff. I think we always noticed how it messed up the lyrics to the opening theme tune, replacing ninja with fighting.
Doesn't make any sense.
And I always noticed how it was kind of fighting. Not a very good cut anyway.
And then you can't hear, he's a radical rat.
So that always kind of messed it up a bit. However, it didn't affect the effectiveness of the turtles as a fad in any way.
I do think it's silly because being ninjas is a huge part of the USP of the show. Hero turtles are much less interesting as a concept than Ninja Turtles.
And as I mentioned, yeah, there was a lot of merchandise, some of which I had and some of which I didn't. I was quite keen at one point on collecting turtle cards. You get a pack of 6 for 20p, those were the days.
God, what do those cost now, that sort of thing? £1? £2?
And as we were discussing recently, yes, trading cards are still quite a popular way of generating merchandising money from these things. And yeah, those turtle cards certainly did the job. And as I say, there were Ladybird books, there were colouring books, there were comics, but what everybody really wanted and could not get hold of was the action figures.
What a silly thing not to be able to get hold of. That's why they made the cartoon, isn't it? To sell action figures.
Turtles figures at one point in the late 80s, early 90s were like absolute gold dust. You couldn't get them anywhere. Everybody, all the boys at least, and perhaps some of the girls, wanted them for Christmas. There was a story about how somebody's mother had found a Leonardo and a Donatello at Toys R Us in Stevenage in some sort of packing crate and absolutely grabbed them and smuggled them out, having paid for them first, I'm sure, because they were the only 2 original Turtles figures left in Hertfordshire, it seemed like. And yeah, everybody wanted them, and you couldn't get them. Our mum tried to order all of them from this catalogue she had at one point. They were all in there, all 4 of them, order these turtles. They wrote back and said, oh no, we can't get these.
Wow, and yet you could get a Turtles advent calendar.
Oh yes, they were rather fun. But what I actually ended up getting was the Wacky Action Turtles figures. But even those were quite rare. They took quite a long time to actually get them in stock at Argos, where they were supposed to have been for a while. And then they suddenly had this whole sort of special offer bin of Wacky Action Raphaels, and that was where it all started. And eventually I managed to get hold of all the Wacky Action Turtles from Argos, and our rich aunt was asked by our mother to send me Splinter and Shredder action figures. And she could only get hold, it seemed, of the Wacky Action versions. And of course she wasn't to know that Sewer Crawl in Splinter looks like crap.
We did have a laugh about it, didn't we? Because what does he do? He wiggles his arse.
But Slice and Dice Shredder is a perfectly adequate shredder, so that was fine.
You did eventually get hold of a Splinter that doesn't look like crap, didn't you? How did you manage that?
It must have been quite some years later when the toy line wasn't like Gold Dust and you could occasionally find it in Toys R Us.
But weren't you telling me recently the Wacky Action Turtles themselves were actually better than the normal ones?
There is a lot to be said, I think, for the Wacky Action Turtles, yeah, as figures. The original figures, the advantage they have is, well, they have proper weapons, but they don't have pupils in their eyes, and their facial expressions are all very uniform, and they don't have as much life as the Wacky Action figures, which makes a lot of sense. Wacky Action Michelangelo, in particular, has his tongue sticking out, which is quite a nice bit of characterization. And yeah, so I was perfectly happy with the Wacky Action Turtles, and I was pleased to have them. But then the end of the Turtles figures story is, the ironic thing was, when we were on summer holiday in Walton-on-the-Naze in Essex in 1991 in a neighbour's static caravan, what did they have in the toy shop in Walton-on-the-Naze but a huge rack of all the Turtles figures? And I thought, well, people have been scrabbling after these for the past 3 or 4 years. Here they all are in Walton-on-the-Naze. And the one I ended up choosing as my thing that I got to get bought from this toy shop was Foot Soldier. Because, of course, well, I was quite happy with my other versions of all the other things, so I ended up getting a Foot Soldier from there, which was quite useful to give the Shredder figure an ally. But I did think that was ironic, and it's something I've always remembered.
Makes me wonder why there was no Bebop and Rocksteady.
Yes, and there were a lot of figures in the line you could see on the back of the card, such as Baxter as Fly, Bebop and Rocksteady, April, Genghis Frog, but none of the other frogs, Krang not in his full new body, but on a kind of walking legs frame, and guest characters such as the Rat King and things like that, Casey Jones. I guess in Walton-on-the-Naze they probably didn't have Krang or Bebop and Rocksteady, as you say, or I'd have got them rather than the Foot Soldier. So there we are, that's the story of the Turtles action figures, and let's move on to talk some more about the cartoon. As I was saying earlier, the BBC didn't get hold of all of it. I reckon they got hold of the first 3 seasons and then stopped after that, which is more than they ever got hold of from Thundercats array, but proportionally, I suppose it's about the same. And I think Rosie was reading some synopses of the seasons online at one point, and I was saying, I'm not sure if they ever had Series 3. And then it was saying how in it the Technodrome is at the centre of the Earth, and the baddies are popping back and forth in these kind of digging machines to get back up to the surface to do their baddieing, and then going back to the Technodrome at the centre of the Earth and them afterwards. And we both, I think, remembered seeing that on the telly. So the BBC had 3 seasons of it.
I think I was reading some blurbs for the DVD releases you could get. I think watching our videos made me interested enough to do that, and I'm quite interested in getting the DVD of 10 fan favourite episodes. I think that sounds like an awfully good idea, because I quite enjoyed our videos. You can also get round here a DVD of 3 episodes centering around each one of the Turtles. So for instance, you can get the best of Donatello, which might be quite good too. And of course nowadays you can just go on eBay and Amazon and stuff and order these things and spend all your money without realising, not like when you had to scrabble around in a crate somewhere in Stevenage.
Yes, what a different world it is within 30 years.
But wasn't the Technodrome in the centre of the Earth, correct me if I'm wrong, when I used to actually get up half an hour earlier to watch it before school when we were in, like, our early to mid-teens?
Yes, this was interesting. They started having a repeat run in middle of 1997 sort of time. I remember I turned 14 while it was going on. And yes, you got up and watched it, and I kind of was thinking, I'm not interested in this rubbish anymore.
I think I just wanted to have a little extra bit of the day in which to enjoy myself, because I wasn't enjoying school much at the time, and we weren't in a fantastic place at home, were we?
It must have been just before Extreme Ghostbusters came into your life.
Ah, yes.
And you can pick up the full significance of that from our Ghostbusters podcast, which is the second one we ever did. But evidently then they were showing season 3 at that point, and they had at one point the frogs and Leatherhead, didn't they? Which you were finding a bit of on YouTube recently, and discovered it was one of the ones where Donatello has the replacement voice. The actor can't be bothered to turn up for the recording session a few times. And that, I think, is Series 3. Wikipedia says where Donatello sometimes has a different voice, and it makes sense if the frogs had first turned up in, like, Season 2, which is the ones we were very familiar with from CBBC and going live, that they would come back for their next appearance and Leatherhead would turn up and antagonise them in Season 3.
I always found the frogs episode very memorable. Not what actually happened, I can't even much remember that now, but I did find it very memorable that there were also 4 mutant frogs, and didn't Shredder train them to be ninjas?
Yes, I remember quite well the scene where he's introducing himself to them. My name is Shredder, and I love all living things, and convincing them the turtles are evil.
That reminds me, when he's in the origin episode changing Bebop and Rocksteady, who are human punks, into a rhino and a warthog, I say to you he should do this to some ninjas and get some actual ninjas to fight the turtles. And you say, oh, well, he does think of that and do it with the frogs. And I believe they started out as frogs, didn't they?
Yes, he goes to this swampland to find the frogs and turn them into mutants. And as it turns out, as Leatherhead, the alligator, lives there and is mutated there as well, it must be the Florida Everglades.
So it's kind of the same thing as the turtles. They started out as turtles and then got trained to be ninjas. But a better idea would be to get some people who are ninjas and who are already evil, so you don't have to bother pretending to love all living things and that, and turn them into mutants, rather than turning a couple of punks into mutants and pretending to your actual ninjas that you're not evil.
And that links in quite nicely with the point we were discussing while watching videos we have, which is about the foot soldiers. Originally, they were supposed to be the members of the Foot Clan from Japan that Shredder had turned to an army of crime after the disgrace, Shredder setting up Splinter when he was human.
We like that bit, don't we? That makes us chuckle, the important visiting ninja people who leap to conclusions.
So, you plot to kill our honourable sensei. I mean, come on, Shredder didn't have to do very much to get Splinter disgraced in the eyes of those jump-to-conclusion high-up sensei people.
And that episode tells us all about the Foot Clan, and for a while, that video with that on it was all we had. So I always just kind of assumed that that was who the foot soldiers were.
And that is what is implied at first. But then, like the Horde troopers on She-Ra, it kind of seems that what starts out as a human army becomes kind of a robot army. And the foot soldiers, like Krang's rock soldiers, are kind of robot creatures, a robot army that the turtles can smash, destroy, punch, kick, kill. Because obviously you can't do that to human people, and we've discussed that in other podcasts, and there are commentaries elsewhere on my channel discussing that aspect of cartoon violence. And it's very true, we were moved to discuss this while watching the videos we have this time, because of course they don't really go back to the foot soldiers on the first video we have, how it all began, and we're kind of left with the impression, oh yes, they're human, they're the Foot Clan. But then in the episode called The Return of the Technodrome, which is actually the end of Season 2, there's this whole army of foot soldiers and rock soldiers, as Krang addresses them, that the turtles are able to fight, destroy, and they do seem to be, this kind of army of robots. So that was an interesting development, a slight sidestep from the original premise.
A much more interesting original premise, but rather limiting, because it would mean they weren't allowed to do anything to the foot soldiers.
So speaking of our videos, there are 3 of them, but as Rosie said, for a long time, for about 15 years, we only had one of them, which is the video called How It All Began. And it's a bit of a strange one, that. It came from, as you may suppose, the collection of videos that we were given that also had Thundercats Exodus, a couple of episodes of He-Man, a couple of episodes of Ghostbusters,
and Spider-Man,
which, as was mentioned in the previous podcast, were hand-me-downs from a rich kid.
I remember distinctly basically going through these videos, our aunt, not our rich aunt, brought round and saying, oh, we'll have this one, we'll have this one, we'll have this one. And some of them we rejected. I don't remember which. But I do remember being pleased to come across the ones that we watched on the television.
Yes, they've been very important in our lives, those videos, and some of them continue to be so to this day. This How It All Began video is obviously designed to be a kind of movie version of the origin story of the cartoon and some episodes from the early part of the second season, and it is that. It does work in that way, but it's a bit of a mess and a bit incoherent in places.
It don't make no sense.
It was very interesting one day to see on perhaps Going Live or CBBC the whole episode that they've taken 10 minutes of footage from at the beginning of the How It All Began video, which is where Splinter's lost his memory and Leonardo, Donatello and Michelangelo are explaining to him all the origin and backstory of the Turtles and Shredder and their interactions and Krang and everything. And it was very interesting to see that because I don't think we'd ever seen it played out on screen before when we got the How It All Began video.
I do remember thinking, oh, this explains a few things. Why the video begins with, your name is Splinter, as if he doesn't know, because he doesn't at that point, and why Raphael is really thrashed right now. I can't remember what he was doing, but he was in some sort of trouble with the bad guys, wasn't he?
Seeing that episode on the telly really did fill in the gaps, and it's not incoherent on the video, but it did make more sense when you get Splinter saying in the full version of the episode, I think I'm starting to remember, wasn't Oroku Saki something to do with the Shredder? And Donatello says exactly, Oroku Saki was the Shredder, but we didn't find that out until he captured you. And then when we cut in on the video with Naturally We Came to Your Rescue, we go, that's why he's saying Naturally We Came to Your Rescue.
Yeah.
Things like that.
You get that Splinter's been carried off. We just get the lead in of him fighting and swiping at this machine that's grabbing him and eventually succeeds.
And we were speculating this time, does it actually say explicitly on the video version Shredder and Oroku Saki are the same person? And of course it is actually in the dialogue. Shredder says, your furry friend knows me as Oroku Saki, but you may call me the Shredder. So it was something we'd always known for sure and hadn't just inferred, although it is very obvious.
As I'm sure everyone knows, it explains why Splinter started off as a human and then is a rat for most of the time that we know him. And I thought kind of slightly all along, I think, but particularly this time around, when he's a human, he doesn't look particularly ancient, does he? And when he's a rat, he's got this old, wise, martial arts guy voice. And on one of our videos he refers to himself as ancient, and he looks really quite young in the flashbacks, and he's supposed to have been Oroku Saki's teacher. Well, he was, I believe that, but it doesn't look like it. It looks like he's his contemporary.
Hamato Yoshi, which is Splinter's original human name, needed to be more of the old Far Eastern sensei, white beard character like you get in things like The Karate Kid and the episode of The Mummy, the animated series called The Boy Who Would Be King, rather than this quite young-looking black-haired character that he is. And wouldn't it be better, we've always thought, even when we first had the How It All Began video, in that flashback, when the mutagen comes down the drain, if Splinter didn't touch one of the turtles before he turned into the rat, whatever animal it had most recently been in contact with. That contradicts itself on screen.
We turtles became human because we'd most recently been with you, but you'd most recently been in contact with the rats, and he's just that second put one of the turtles down, having picked him up and given him a wipe because he's covered in mutagen.
Yes, by what plays out on screen, they should become 5 human-turtle hybrids, really. 1 starting as human and 4 starting as turtles, but there we are. And that video goes on to have bits of quite a few episodes, and sometimes, I would say perhaps only about 5 minutes or just over of a particular episode, and it ends up as a bit of a mess. There's a couple of bits from the arc involving the Eye of Sarnath, which is this gem from another dimension with strange powers that's been split into certain fragments that do certain things. And I remember watching that whole arc on CBBC, and I think particularly on Going Live, it was one of the first things they showed when they got the Turtles. And in the end, there is a thrilling conclusion to the Eye of Sarnoff stuff, and it's all put back together, and Baxter discovers the Eye's weakness. It has no effect on gold. Do you remember that?
Not at all.
But in the video, there's only a couple of bits of the build-up to that. There's a lot of the one where the turtles shrink, and we've mentioned on other podcasts that there are often ones where they shrink, and it's quite effectively done in the Turtles.
Yes, I noticed with that one, in order for Shredder to shrink them, they have to be temporarily crap, so he can quite easily trap them in nets and stuff.
And there's a very small part of another Eye of Sarnoff episode with the plants growing large and Shredder sending plants to attack the Turtles.
And Splinter's all like, oh, I don't think we've seen the last of that plant, but actually, according to the video, we have.
So it's a bit of a mess in that way, and the Eye of Sarnoff thing is the only kind of coherent, overriding plot that attempts to go through the video, and they don't have the beginning and they don't have the end, and it doesn't seem to fit together that well. And then suddenly we're into the machines are taking over episode. So yeah, it's very useful for looking back at the Turtles and getting the origin story clear in your mind, and enjoying a good lot of turtle power action, but as a coherent movie version of the Turtles' origin and some bits of season 2, it's rather lacking. Of course, it has probably my very favourite part of the Turtles that I find absolutely hilarious, where April's in the meeting at Channel 6, and she's trying to hide from her boss, Mr. Thompson, the fact that Splinter's trying to contact her on the Turtle com, and it ends up with April going, "Who, me?" and Splinter going, "April," and Mr. Thompson goes, "Yes, you, April," and that absolutely makes me fall about and always has for more than 20 years.
Yes, that is very funny, and then of course, when she goes off to help them, she's saying, "You said yourself we have to make split-second decisions." He goes, "But that was only a speech," satirising how the things that your boss tells you he doesn't really mean at all, he just does it to sound good.
I think that's absolutely wonderful little bit of satire about our world effectively done, even though we don't have mutant turtles things in it. Very relatable. And he's amusing Mr. Thompson, isn't he? Because he's having an affair with his secretary, which they snuck under the radar there. His PA, I suppose. He does have, I think, a wife and family, but it's made very obvious. What is it, Snookums? That the PA does more for him than filing.
That wouldn't be funny now, would it?
No, it wouldn't. We can't laugh at that sort of thing anymore. And we were saying this time how it's a shame that a couple of other characters from Channel 6 aren't on the video. You thought particularly Vernon, the cameraman and soundman man, and I thought particularly Irma. Unfortunately, they are on the other two videos we have. I found Irma very memorable, and as it turns out, she's a pretty poor role model for the female audience, really. All she wants is a man, any man.
Yes, and she was saying such things in those clips I was finding. I watched one on YouTube. What did I want to see? Leatherhead, possibly? And then it kept recommending more and more, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting, that sounds interesting. And one of them was Irma basically saying the only thing a woman is supposed to want is a man. She said something like, oh, you can only be a new woman by getting yourself a new man, which was horrifying, wasn't it?
So there we are, plenty of pluses and minuses for the How It All Began video, and it's been a very positive experience in more recent years to add 2 videos to that to make a 3-video turtle collection.
I found both of those, didn't I? I don't remember in which order these things happened or which video it was, but one of them was at this fete in a little village called Sandridge, and somebody was selling old books and videos and things, and I seem to remember I found one of our Thundercats videos, which I didn't mention on the last podcast because I forgot.
We didn't actually mention on the last podcast, we had the video of Pumra and Splitting Image before getting the DVD version of Thundercats, and it wasn't an important detail at the time, but now it is. So there it is mentioned.
And one of our Turtles videos. And the other one I found when I was in the town centre around Christmas, and one of the shops had got in it a temporary charity shop just for Christmas time. So I thought, I'll go in there and see what they've got. lot, and it was well worth it because they had a Disney movie tie-in edition of The Rescuers by Marjorie Sharp, a book which I'd been wanting to read since I'd read it in year 3 or year 4, and this other Turtles video. So that was a very successful shopping trip, and I got them both quite cheap, I should think.
And they do make quite a nice, coherent group of 3 videos to watch, beginning with the origin, as has been described, and then we have the video with the case of the killer pizzas, which is an episode I remember quite well from watching it on CBBC, with the eggs that look like meatballs and hatch into these kind of dinosaur things.
I remember that too, and I remember not really knowing what meatballs were, but I suppose you can work it out from the name. But I was a bit confused because I wasn't sure if meatballs were things that monsters hatched out of or not, but no, the eggs just looked like meatballs.
And then that's followed by Enter the Fly, which is quite useful to watch because there's a lot of Shredder and Baxter on the How It All Began video, and it shows you what happens to Baxter in the end when he becomes his action figure, the Fly hybrid.
And it's exactly like what happens to Jeff Goldblum in The Fly, isn't it?
And it's the bit where we see Bebop and Rocksteady return to Earth from Dimension X and get into a status quo that we're very familiar with. And then the final video is a good way to finish off because it has Return of the Technodrome, which is the last episode of Season 2, the last episode of the whole kind of sequence of events we've been watching through the 3 videos. And it also has an episode with some very funny bits that we enjoyed. The cat lady from Channel 6, where April accidentally splices DNA with a cat for a while. But we made quite a lot of interesting general comments about the cartoon while we were watching those 3 videos. One trouble that they have, the animators and storyboarders have, and this was something that was always noticeable when it was on the telly, is that they sometimes colour the turtles' masks and other bits of coloured bands in the wrong colours, and the turtle speaking doesn't match the turtle who's being drawn on screen. And it must have been hard, mustn't it, not to make mistakes like that with the characters all looking so similar, but they do make quite a lot of them.
And they make some really silly ones too, like when Leonardo is talking. So obviously he was on the storyboard, because this is what confuses them. The storyboard with the dialogue. And then Raphael is going, oh help, this creature's grabbed me. So they've got Raphael speaking with Leonardo's voice, and then the creature grabbing him, but he was supposed to get grabbed off screen. Things like that, they should be more careful to figure out what's going on.
It's always an oh dear moment when Irma's looking into the turtle com and saying, who are you? And it's the turtle with the red band, and he goes, I'm Leonardo. And we're like, no.
Possibly the worst one, though, is where there's 2 Raphaels and 1 Donatello on screen, and the Donatello speaks with Raphael's voice.
Ouch. And of course, a very noticeable thing about that problem is that it has happened with the 2 title cards, and I always used to notice this, and you can tell from the characterization. You've got Michelangelo, apparently, with Leonardo's swords looking all serious and ninja on one title card, and then the other one is apparently Leonardo looking all happy and slavering over a pizza. So obviously, they got the 2 characters mixed up. But a very positive comment we both had about the episodes we watched on video, and I'm sure it holds true for the rest of the cartoon as well, is that it doesn't take itself too seriously. It's a lot of fun, it's unashamedly silly fun at times, and it revels in that and makes it work. And I think with the whole idea of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that silliness is important to acknowledge and involve, and I think later versions, CG films, cartoons, where they try and be a bit more serious and dark, do suffer because they're not so much fun. The fun of the original cartoon series is a big plus for it.
For me, even though I wouldn't walk over hot coals for it, it's one of those things where you really can't better the original and it's silly to try. What was that film that was mostly about Leonardo and Raphael? And I do remember this bit where they're having a go at each other and they're telling each other their characterization. Oh, you take everything too seriously. Oh, you're too headstrong. That was very annoying. And it's like I was saying in the last podcast, it's these writers who go to film writing school and they learn, oh, you have to have conflict in your film. So they have conflict between the protagonists.
Yes, that's the CG version from, I think, 2007. And yeah, it was really mainly all about Leonardo and Raphael having beef, and what I found particularly bad as a consequence of that was that Donatello and Michelangelo weren't in it hardly. They weren't proper primary characters, certainly. Which is a great shame, because we wanted to see them as an awesome foursome.
Which we get in the cartoon, and they do work well as a team. Sometimes they kind of bicker and they have a sort of sibling relationship, don't they? And in pretty much anything else you watch, they are siblings, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I suppose they could be, and it makes sense for them to have been siblings all along, but they never mentioned that.
And I think the 90s live-action movies with the Jim Henson turtle suits are quite fun. I've seen them all once this century.
I rejected the opportunity to watch those. I don't know why.
I don't think they become overly, stupidly serious like the 21st century versions that you get. But I don't think they're quite as fun and silly and tongue-in-cheek as the cartoon. So yeah, the original cartoon, that's, as you say, something that I don't think you can better. It is just how the format works best. And we do enjoy watching it because of that.
The thing about it, though, not taking itself too seriously, is that they do take that element a bit too far, I think, when they start acknowledging that they are on television and they are a cartoon. Now, I was saying even Tiny Toon Adventures can do that at the wrong time and misjudge that. And I was saying Fantastic Max ought not to have done that because I didn't think it was the right kind of show, and I feel the same way about the Turtles. The thing that does it best, as I think we will have discussed on that podcast, is Earthworm Jim. And Earthworm Jim is a superhero cartoon that doesn't take itself at all seriously, and it can get away with pretty much anything, but the Turtles can't. It's just serious and just believable enough for it to grate when they start saying, oh, this had better work, or it'll be a 2-part episode, and that kind of thing. And partly I think it's because they don't do it from the beginning, do they?
That's absolutely right. I remember being struck by that problem when you were watching some of it in the mornings in 1997, and that backs up the thoughts we were having earlier about it having been season 3. I was wandering round, getting my breakfast or whatever, and Bebop was saying about some sort of guest character, gee, pretty corny dialogue, and I thought, wow, what the hell is this? Well, I didn't get up half an hour earlier to watch this. So yeah, I stand by the observation that Turtles was a fad I got caught up in, not because I really specially liked it, but I do really specially like the cartoon, actually, for what it is and for how it treats itself and how it fulfills its purpose. During this Turtles fad, everybody used to say that Raphael was their favourite. Raphael's ninja weapons are called Sai, actually. I didn't get round to filling in that piece of information earlier, so there it is.
No, you didn't. I thought you must not know. Perhaps those boys who were making fun of me in the playground said Raphael first for their right order.
And I suppose the reason that he was everyone's favourite is that he's cool but crude and rather sassy. But I never really liked him as a character for that, and I found him a bit annoying. And even now, when we watch the videos, I do find Raphael a bit too acerbic, a bit too critical, a bit too much of a downer. So that's why he's never been in the running for my favourite.
He's sort of quite rude, isn't he? He's not the one that you'd want for your friend, even if you did enjoy watching him on TV. Or maybe you would if you were a boy and they seem to like taking the mickey out of each other.
And of course, as you mentioned, they have stepped that up in the beef with Leonardo in that CG movie, and it is something that's come back to, and obviously something that whoever's in charge of making new Turtle stuff finds fertile as something to do with a character. But yeah, I've never found it very appealing. Raphael's voice in the cartoon is provided by Rob Paulson, who we heard in many other places in the 90s, and we've mentioned on the podcast because he's in Tiny Toon Adventures, Animaniacs, and we haven't podcasted about it, but we've mentioned before Rob Paulson took the lead role or dual role in the Mask cartoon, so you really could hear him a lot in the 90s cartoons, and certainly not an unwelcome experience to do so.
I think we should just mention, as we're mentioning their weapons, what colour bands they have on. Raphael's are red. Of course, everybody knows this, but I'd just like to prove that I know it too.
Now, when people were telling me that Raphael was their favourite, no, why wasn't he my favourite? I used to say that my favourite turtle was Leonardo.
I'm just going to say now, I could never understand that when I was little. I always found Leonardo the most boring out of all the characters.
I have been forced to conclude over the past 30 years or so that yes, Leonardo really is rather boring and not a very enjoyable character to watch. But I think what I liked about him when I was little was that he had blue bands, and that was my favourite colour, even though green and blue don't go very well together. And I also liked his weapons best. I could identify, yes, he's got a couple of swords, but Raphael and his sai, I mean, what the hell are those? The nunchucks that we don't even get to see Michelangelo using, and a wooden pole, that's not much of a weapon. Little did I know it could disarm any adversary at that point. But I liked characters with swords, and I liked characters with blue, and Leonardo had blue bands and the two swords, and I liked that, and I guess that was why he was my favourite. But actually, Raphael's right. He's a bit of a stick in the mud. He's a bit boring, and objectively, he really wouldn't qualify as my favourite.
Would you say that Leonardo has the power of leadership like Hazel and Ty, or is he just a bit bossy?
I think to some extent he does have the power of leadership. And what I was noticing while we were watching the videos is that he is slightly more on the ball about organising what they're supposed to be doing in battle situations. He's the one who remembers Splinter saying this, that, or the other and realises how it can be used to sort everything out. In the case of the Killer Pizzas, Leonardo is the one who has bothered to hear from Baxter that a huge jolt of electricity could revert the creatures to meatballs, and Leonardo spots the opportunity to do that and does it with his sword, whereas the other three aren't as good tactically, I don't think, as Leonardo. I think that does come through. All three of them at times did certain things that perhaps hadn't been thought through properly, and way to go, Donatello, you've lost the remote control and that sort of thing. So perhaps Leonardo in some ways is the most level-headed and kind of leads from the point of view of he is the kind of organisational crux of the team.
Yes, I wasn't sure about that, but of course you're right. I do remember being curious about the Ninja Turtles appearing in the recent Ghostbusters comics, still ongoing in fact, and finding this page where Leonardo was being incredibly bossy to Kylie, and I actually didn't like that very much. I thought, well, what gives Leonardo the right to come and boss Kylie, one of my favourite characters ever? I guess maybe Kylie and Leonardo would get on a bit better in the cartoon universes.
And perhaps being sensible and level-headed and tactically good is a combination that can make a bit of a boring character at times, and perhaps Leonardo does suffer from that in some ways. I was thinking perhaps a great voice actor, a quirky voice actor, could have got more fun out of him anyway, but of course Leonardo was voiced by Cam Clarke, who we've praised hugely in our Dogtanian podcast as the original proper voice of Dogtanian, and what a difference there is between Dogtanian with his lively, quirky, fun, endearing, leading the show personality, and Leonardo, the old stick in the mud. Yeah, they're both Cam Clarke. Perhaps Cam just didn't engage with the role of Leonardo like he did with that of Dogtanian.
I don't know if maybe it helped him to have the pictures to refer to, if maybe he listened to the performance in Spanish, even if he didn't understand it, he got kind of what the character was like from that. I don't know what more you could do with Leonardo, but then I'm not a great voice actor.
It's a tricky one, that. And I believe your favourite turtle is, and always has been, Donatello.
This is very strange. I used to say my favourite was Donatello, and I don't know why I used to say that. I know why he's my favourite now, possibly jointly with another one, the other remaining one, who we'll come to soon. I suppose I knew my favourite wasn't Raphael like you did, and it wasn't Leonardo. I think it might secretly have been Michelangelo, but when I was younger, for some reason I didn't seem to want to admit that. Perhaps I thought that people would judge me for liking the one who is frivolous. I shouldn't have thought that, should I? I should have just been true to myself, and really there's nothing wrong with what Michelangelo does. So that's why I said Donatello. I mean, I didn't particularly like purple, which is his band's. I probably wasn't particularly impressed with his simple wooden bow, which, as you were saying, can disarm any adversary, and let's mention that because it's funny. It's during the How It All Began flashbacks explaining to Splinter to cure him of amnesia stuff. Leonardo's saying who the turtles all are, and it's me, I'm Leonardo, Donatello, whose simple wooden bow can disarm any adversary, and Raphael and Michelangelo. It's like, what's the point of mentioning that then, if you're not going to talk about anyone else's weapons? Obviously, Leonardo's very impressed with Donatello's simple wooden bow.
Donatello has the phallus, so everyone's secretly jealous of him.
But now, having watched the videos a couple of times as an adult, I've realised I do like Donatello. I like his voice. It's a fun, quirky voice, and when I found that Leatherhead clip, I was awfully miffed that it was some other guy, and like sometimes happens in these things, like Benedict Cumberbatch was replaced for an episode of Cabin Pressure on the radio, the actor does a perfectly reasonable impression or approximation of the voice, and there's not really anything wrong with it, but you just miss the person that you're used to who does it their way that's really good. And what I also like about Donatello is that he has the kind of funny one-liners. Raphael may think he does, but he's only got the rude acerbic ones. Donatello just makes amusing little comments in kind of a deadpan way. His voice isn't deadpan, but he uses the same inflections he always uses, no matter what he's saying. Like when April's done a bit of gene swapping with the cat, and they're finding the cat, and the cat is snuggling up to Donatello, and he's saying, "See, I told you I was her favourite," and things like that. I enjoy that, and I suppose what it is, it's Donatello kind of taking things in his stride, saying it as he sees it, and just calmly getting on with things. I admire that, but I never would have thought of any of that when I was little.
Yes, looking at it in the cold light of day, I do agree with your reasons for having Donatello as a favourite, and I would find it hard to justify anyone as my favourite with arguments that I would find equally compelling. So perhaps Donatello's my favourite too.
Of course, the other thing about Donatello is that he does machines. He's the kind of scientist character, the one that they don't have in Thundercats for Vulture Man to be the counterfoil to, as we were discussing. I suppose if Donatello was going to have one of those, like in Extreme Dinosaurs, I'm thinking of now, it would be Baxter, but they don't really pit their science against each other, do they? Or not that I've seen. Maybe they do in episodes we don't have the video.
But of course they wouldn't have had much time to do that, with Baxter coming to the end of his arc quite quickly and becoming the Fly. So I don't think, certainly, it would have been a long-term aspect of Donatello's role in the show, which, yes, is an omission.
When I was watching Extreme Dinosaurs, when I was just kind of nearly growing out of such things, it reminded us of TMNT, didn't it? The characters are basically the same. There's the leading one and the science one and the smart mouth one and the more frivolous, fun-loving one, and the science one was Stegs, and the bad guys, the Raptors, had their own scientist, and they really did have a science rivalry, and I've always kind of thought that's how it should be done since then, which is why I've commented on it for Thundercats and this Turtles podcast.
Before doing this podcast, I realised we must look up and check we know the name of Donatello's voice actor, because I have known off the top of my head the other three voice actors for many years, but I was saying I don't think Donatello's voice actor is in as many things that I know, and perhaps isn't in as many cartoons, but you looked up and found out his name is Barry Gordon. And he's been in a lot of cartoons in the 90s and beyond.
It's said that he's best known for voicing Donatello and some other character in something that I don't know what it is and I can't remember. And also it listed quite a few other things I haven't really watched but I may have heard of.
And then I thought, well, I suppose I only know Michelangelo's voice actor, Townsend Coleman, from one other thing, Where's Wally, in which he voiced the lead character of Wally.
Or Waldo in America.
Indeed. And that's a show that we've mentioned quite a few times on podcasts, but we're not going to podcast about. But yeah, Townsend Coleman voiced the party dude, Michelangelo, with the kind of Valley, West Coast / Hawaiian style party dude accent, which we've mentioned as having been sported also by Shirley the Loon on Tiny Toon Adventures.
He's really the one who says cowabunga and dude and all that kind of stuff, which I have heard people, possibly not au fait with Ninja Turtle stuff, associate with the Turtles generally, but it's really all him.
Yeah, I always spotted that when I was little, and it's true, even dude is, as you say, all Michelangelo. When I had the Turtles comic at one point, our grandmother was reading it aloud and pronouncing dude as dude, as old people tended to do at the time. I thought, well, it's really only Michelangelo who says dude or dude on the cartoon at any rate. But the character is a lot of fun, and I always used to say he was my second favourite. Perhaps he was the one I actually enjoyed on the show most.
Yes, that's definitely me too. I found him the most engaging, and he is very engaging and fun. And by the way, his bands are orange, and we mentioned his nunchucks,
which we're not allowed to see. But yes, he is the laid-back, fun one, the one who's keenest on scoffing a lot of pizza as well, although they do all like it. But he's not completely useless and completely frivolous. He is a useful part of the team. He has a clever plan in that machines taking over episode where he sits on some TNT and gets the pile driver thing to blow itself up, for example. He doesn't fall into the trap of becoming a useless comic relief stupid character, which he could have done, and the cartoon skillfully avoids that and ensures that all the turtles have a useful and, in some ways, engaging role to play in the show, which is good.
Yeah, they do work really well as a team, all four of them, and they have all these coordinated ninja moves and stuff, and they do things like catch each other if they need to jump up somewhere or out of the way of something, and I was enjoying all that when we were watching it recently. I like to see protagonists working well as a team, and they've all been specially trained to work together as a team of ninjas, and that's what they do back in the day, not in these stupid films if you try and watch them, although I know a lot of fans absolutely adore them and want more and more and more.
And of course the rat person, who has instructed and honed their skills, as everybody knows, is Splinter, and he was voiced by Peter Renaday, whose voice I think was most recognisable as Mandrake from Defenders of the Earth. He does a slightly different voice for Splinter, but once I found that out, I thought, oh yeah, that is the same person. And he also voiced Vernon. And as Splinter and Vernon, he can be very funny and set up very well for some very funny punchlines and play his role in a lot of funny sequences without being exuberantly amusing himself, which is quite difficult skill.
One of the best bits on our video is the cat mutant gene splicing one, where suddenly, as happens in these things, Splinter has a terrible fear of cats, and at one stage in the cartoon a tiger has got loose from the zoo or somewhere, and we know April is after the turtles and going to their lair to kill them and stuff, and Splinter's there kind of meditating and saying, oh, I must get rid of this dreaded fear of cats. And then the next thing you know, this tiger's walking in, which is much funnier than Cat April walking in, because it's so random. He would recognise April and not be completely surprised to see that she'd been mutated. But in comes this tiger, and he goes, ah! That's not going to help him get over his fear of cats. He wasn't expecting that.
Yes, very skillful voice acting there, making a very funny scene without actually being funny yourself. And another striking voice in the series is James Avery of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air fame as Shredder. And I've always enjoyed a lot of Shredder's deliveries. He does manage to be amusing, but always genuinely threatening as well. And again, in the few episodes where James Avery hasn't bothered to turn up for the recording session, I used to find that very disappointing, where Shredder had the wrong voice. So a very important part of the show too, James Avery's voice.
What a brilliant acting resume, mainly The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
And then the other voice actor who we've mentioned in at least one previous podcast as having been in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is Pat Fraley, who voiced Bravestar and many, many other cartoon voices. And I'm sure I mentioned in our Bravestar podcast that the character Cactus Head on Bravestar I thought was very close always to the voice for Krang that Pat Fraley uses on the Turtles. And actually Baxter's voice is quite close to Krang as well. You can hear it in the Fly episode where they're talking to each other. Krang's like, I am going to disintegrate you. And Baxter's talking to him as you would. And Krang is, unlike Mumra, one of these villains where he's like the big boss character and he tells the other villains, the main villain, what to do.
Like Stampede and Complex and Horde Prime.
And we've always enjoyed Krang while watching the videos, I think.
He's really funny.
And we did have quite an interesting hash out about exactly the funniness and threateningness of Krang recently, because he is a lot more comical than Shredder. So he does have something of a balance of being funny and being genuinely evil, but because he is so funny, he's not exactly a threatening or scary villain. He's more of a comedy villain, and you believe his motivation and his threats, and he will follow through on his evil.
It is quite hardcore when he wants to disintegrate Baxter.
But he doesn't have the same kind of evil presence as Shredder and Skeletor, because he is mainly very funny. So it's a difficult balance to strike, and Pat Fraley does it very well, being very funny and being a genuine threat.
Shall we quote some of our favourite Krang funny bits?
Yeah.
There's, I didn't have to warn you, you know. The kind of banter he gets into with Shredder, that's very amusing. Once on an early school morning when I was watching it, Shredder was on the communicator thing with Krang complaining about something, and Krang's response is, "So sue me!" And then he hangs up, or whatever you call it. And then you get that a bit later when the plan's all gone wrong, and Krang is saying, "Oh, Shredder, you should have done this, you should have done that, you've done it all wrong." And Shredder goes, "So sue me." And you think,
It's all symptoms of the show not taking itself too seriously, isn't it? The villains are genuinely trying to do something evil, and you believe it, but also, as individual characters and as a pair having banter, it's entertaining and a bit silly.
What's that bit you like?
Krang has hacked into the kind of TV broadcast system to address the world in the Return of the Technodrome and tell them that he's going to come and take over. And he's bigging himself up. I am Krang, ruler of Dimension X, your new master. Hi! and that made us laugh quite a lot when we first got the video, and we still laugh at it now. And you like from that episode as well, now something's wrong with the drill mechanism.
Yes, that's funny, because it's very like how we feel about things when we're trying to work the video as it used to be, or the tablet as it is nowadays. I don't know how wrong those go, I don't have one. You know, something technical. And it's this brain with a face in this giant evil kind of doom machine thing, reacting in the same way that we would in our everyday lives, because in fact that is Krang's everyday life, trying to do this sort of thing, trying to take over and enslave everyone and whatever else it's trying to do.
There's a Krang line I've always remembered that I haven't seen on any repeats or videos that I can recall, but I think sums up rather nicely what we've been saying about him. He and Shredder are doing something with some sort of mechanical menace, and they both have a remote control, and they're discussing the evil things they're going to do with this death machine, whatever it is, and having their banter and arguing. And Krang says to Shredder something like, "Remember, Shredder, my remote control is more powerful than yours," and we think, yes, here we are in this scene, Krang's asserting his authority, but it actually turns out he's making a bit of a joke. Mine works the TV, the stereo, and the microwave, or something like that, which was a bit of a joke out of left field, and I remember enjoying and laughing at.
You know, that reminds me of a remote control bit in Earthworm Jim, which I think demonstrates how Earthworm Jim goes quite a lot further with that kind of humour, where Peter Puppy is trying to use the remote control on Jim's super suit, and he's jabbing this button like, why doesn't it work? And then it turns out that the garage back home is opening and closing. That's the kind of thing that's too silly and too comical for the Turtles, which is why they shouldn't say things about dialogue in two-part episodes.
So when it does manage to stay that side of the line, like it does on our videos, it's very much enjoyable. And then when it strays over, makes me come into the living room before school and think, pfft.
Then you would go to school and think, pfft, wouldn't you?
Yes, indeed.
I'd like to just say a little bit more about the other three main characters. Let's talk about Bebop and Rocksteady, because I think that's going to be fairly quick. I've always admired Bebop's septum piercing. I always thought that was very clever. I was saying earlier on that they're punks, and he had a pierced septum, and then he becomes a warthog. And of course, pigs, boars on farms, they have a ring through their nose, don't they? And I read from Ian Blyton that that's because if you pull it and they don't follow you, it's unbearable agony for them. Apparently, if they follow you, it's okay. Bulls have that as well, don't they, for the exact same reason. Of course, Bebop doesn't need his for that purpose, but it's a kind of pig image and a punk thing too. So I always thought that was terribly, terribly clever. Perhaps it's not as clever as that. But I think when I was younger, I used to go around saying or thinking I liked Rocksteady better, and I can't think why I would have said that. Is there any difference between them as characters?
Well, I think Rocksteady is slightly stupider, actually. Like, Bebop is the one who points out, whilst the turtles are trained ninjas, they'll squash your frogs to jelly. But other than that, they're just the kind of comedy duo that there's not a lot to choose between.
I think probably I like Rhino slightly better than Warthogs, even though he did have the very clever pierced septum nose ring. And I thought Rocksteady was a more interesting name than Bebop, but nowadays I don't prefer one over the other. And I do think we ought to mention April again. I've always thought, and I only just recently said to Jake, I always thought her costume was very strange. Yellow jumpsuit she wears. Most people don't wear that to read the news in New York, do they? And be an investigative reporter and report the news as it's happening. That's not reading it, is it? And you agreed with me about that.
Yes, it is a very strange costume, and isn't really appropriate in any way to her role in the show.
Maybe it was easy to draw and easy to animate or something. And I do remember seeing a picture of Megan Fox wearing a yellow jumpsuit as April for a really quite recent film that I think people didn't like so very much, and is in fact the one in which Splinter just looks like crap. And another thing I noticed this time around, and I don't know if I might upset some people saying this, but she doesn't do that much actual sorting things out. The Turtles do all that with their ninja moves and stuff, and she mostly just puts it on the news.
It was quite a pleasant surprise on the How It All Began video when she did actually come through and save the day, and the machines come to life one by unplugging the computer unexpectedly. She should have had more moments like that.
Yes, and proportionally, maybe she has that many in other episodes. Sort of 20% of the time she'll do something like that. That's not to say there's anything kind of wrong with her as a character or a strong female woman. Which reminds me, she doesn't seem interested in men at all, does she? Irma's all, oh, I want a man, you want a man, let's go get some men, and April doesn't seem that bothered about it. So that's good that she is as a role model for girls who might want to grow up and be independent and not be chasing after men all the time, or boys.
And certainly with Irma around, you need that to balance it out.
When I was looking at these clips on YouTube, quite a lot of the comments were, "Oh my god, April is so hot." I can't say I noticed that myself.
So there we are, lots and lots of thoughts about Teenage Mutant Ninja / Hero Turtles. And an end to this particular podcast. But hopefully you'll join us again sometime in January for our next podcast, which will be our 2018 update podcast, in which we will discuss updates on a few things, such as Watership Down, Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, a couple of other things, and we will elucidate our plans for the Olden Days podcast in 2019 and tell you what the first of those podcasts will be about. Until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.